Hello, friends. I'm Anil Bansal, a board member of IAAC. I'm so honored and humbled to introduce conversation between two major celebrities. We have with us Professor Abhijit Banerjee, a renowned professor of economics at MIT, and Nandana Dev Se, an award-winning actress, writer, and a child activist. We have a big treat for our audience today. And we are here so proud to have Nandaji bring incredible work of poems by her mother, Nabaneeta Dev Se. Her work of over 60 years translated from Bengali to English so we all can enjoy them. Again, I'm honored to present to you Professor Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee, who is a Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. In 2003, he co-founded Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab with Esther Duflo and Senthil Mullain Nathan, and he remains one of the lab's director. Professor Banerjee is a past president of Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development, International Research Fellow at the Kiel Institute, a Fellow of American Academy of Arts and Science and Econometrics in Society. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, an Alfred P. Sloan Fellow, and a winner of Infosys Prize. Professor Banerjee is author of a large number of articles and 4 books, including Poor Economics, which won the Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year award, and Good Economics for Hard Times. Both he co-authored with Esther Duflo. He is the editor of 3 more books and has directed 2 documentary films. He has served on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. He is a co-recipient of 2019 Cervantes Riggs Bank Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel for his groundbreaking work in development economic research. And the star of today's show is Nandana Dev Se, an award-winning actress, writer, and a child rights activist. Nandana is the author of 6 children's books and translated in 15 languages globally. She grew up in India, England, and in America, and has starred in over 20 feature films from 4 continents and in multiple languages. Nandana's first book, Kangaroo Kisses, was selected by 320 UK nurseries as a book of excellence. And her interactive workshops has been loved by more than 30,000 young people across this world. After graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard University, where she won the John Harvard Scholarship and Elizabeth Agassiz Prize each year, and studied filmmaking at USC School of Cinema and Television. Nanda worked as a book editor, a screenwriter, an advocate for child protection, and of course, as a Princess Jasmine in Disneyland. The winner of Last Girl Champion Award, as well as several Best Actress Award, Nanda has served on the jury of multiple child protection commissions, global film festivals, and international literary prizes. As an advocate and ambassador, she has worked for UNICEF, the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, Operation Smile, Rahi, and Apne Apne International to fight against child abuse and to end human trafficking. Nandana is a brand ambassador of child protection for Save Children India. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us join them.
Thank you so much for that incredibly warm and extremely generous introduction to both of you. We're delighted to be here, and a huge thanks to the brilliant team for putting this beautiful celebration together. Jhimada, I know that you are incredibly busy, and I know that you have made time to be with us today because of the great love that you've always had for Ma. So thank you.
And for you, and for your family.
And for me. I accept that. So I would like to take a minute, if I may, to introduce Abhijit, who has always been Jhimada to me all my life. I would
As
like
you've been
to,
Tumpa.
and as I have been Tumpa. So yeah, I want to tell you, the Abhijit, the Jhimada that I grew up with. You know, of course, that he is one of the most important economists of our time, in fact, of all time. But what you may not know is that he has an incurable addiction to books. And he also is an extremely talented and obsessive cook. And I have, in fact, been the beneficiaries of both of these compulsive behaviors of Jhimada for many, many years. In fact, when I moved to college, Jhimada and Tulidi were a big part of my support system. And throughout my days as a young adult, and we spent many days and nights and meals at all their different homes in the Cambridge, Boston area. We've spent many excited arguments about the books we were reading. I remember we had one of the conversations that went on forever and ever was this conversation that we were having about shadow lines. Do you remember? Because it had recently come out, Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh, and we just had so many. It's not a big book. It's a thin and absolutely brilliant book. And we had so much that to say and notice and discuss about that book. But not only that, we spoke a lot about magical realism, about the rise of Indian writing in English, which was a huge, there was an explosion of it at that time. We both loved magical realism a lot. We spoke about that. We spoke about poetry. We spoke about Bangla poetry. We spoke about bilingual books of poetry, like the Penguin Modern Classic series, of which you had several at your home. So we had, I had the pleasure of having a very special and relationship with Jhimada and Tulidi, which included great literature and great food. Unfortunately, when I moved away from Boston, those meetings happened less frequently, but it was a critical part of my coming of age as a young adult. But the truth is, our families actually go back much, much longer than that. My parents and Jhimada's parents, Deepak Mama and Minimashi, had been friends for a very long time, both together and separately. And the four children, Jhimada, and then my older sister, Antara, I'm going in order of age, then Jhimada's younger brother, Aniruddha, and then me. The four of us grew up in these two stunning old Kolkata houses, which were overflowing with books and kind of breaking down in parts, which were about 5 minutes away from each other. And we grew up with very much that we were brought up and there were great commonalities between the way we were brought up. We were brought up with the same values is too strong a word, but certainly the same influences, the same interests, the same books. Jhimada and I actually went to the same schools and colleges. We went to South Point, we went to Presidency College, we ended up at Harvard. So we, in fact, throughout our lives, we accepted and rejected many of the same forces and influences. And we've discussed this at many times when we've had our addas. But I keep thinking about the last conversation that we had in person, Jhimada, which was also the last time you met my mother. I remember it extremely well. It was the 24th of October in 2019. It was exactly 2 weeks before my mother passed away. and you had an incredibly busy schedule, but this was a priority for you, and you made the time, and Ma was completely delighted. Do you?
And so was I. I mean, it was extraordinarily, given how sick she was. This was I mean, she was just, somehow she decided to summon up her energy for that moment, and it was like old times. She was just vivacious and funny and joking. She asked me, "Hey, didn't you just win some kind of a prize?" That was her opening line. It was just, the whole thing was kind of very typical of her, of
Yes.
just the way she was in the world. And
Yes.
that was, I mean, it's very sad that I didn't see her after that, but it was also, if I had to remember a moment, it's a very good moment to hold on to. It's just,
She promised to see you because you were planning to come back in January, and I know that you made a promise to each other of seeing each other at that time. It was going to be her birthday, and anyway, you were going to be back at that time. She was so delighted, and it was the last time she had any kind of a social interaction. And in any case, it was just you and the family, right? There wasn't anyone else. It was, that day was very special also, because as it turns out, it is the book, the day on which my mother signed the contract for Acrobat. So she was very excited about that. That is the day, October 21st.
Oh, wow.
That's the day on the which I see as an auspicious sign. I think October 21st
Indeed.
was auspicious in a number of different ways. And you gave her this book, well, not this version, because remember in Kol, am I visible? I sort of keep going in and out of. I'm okay. The Bangla one is the Indian one is a red, like a bright red cover, which she loved, and she was so touched to get it. It was the last book that she started to read, and I don't know how far she went. She was able to read,
she
but
opened it.
no, she read the preface, and she loved the preface. She told me that, actually. So I know that she read that, and I think she started reading the first chapter. And since I have this in my hand, I want to take just a minute to read a couple of lines from the preface, because for a number of reasons. One, because I feel it's a way of invoking her. I feel that it's lovely to have an opportunity to read a few lines written by you from a book that she held in her hands and a preface that she had read. But also because I think these lines kind of remind me of Acrobat, although this is a book of economics, as we know, and Acrobat is very much a book of poetry. But like you, Ma wrote her poetry to hold on to hope, to tell ourselves a story of what went wrong and why, but also as a reminder of all that has gone right. A book as much about the problems as about how our world can be put back together, as long as we are honest with the diagnosis. And I think my mother's poetry was, with every word, searching for an honest diagnosis. This poem is called In Poetry. I'll read it in Bangla now, it's the first poem, just for all of you to get a sense of the music of the language. যতকাল কবিতায় বেঁচে থাকো, ফুটে থাকো, অমোঘ পাসপোর্ট ছবি হয়ে প্রত্যেক লাইনে তুমি জেগে থাকো, আখণ্ড তেষ্টার মতন ছাতি ফাটা যন্ত্রণা আমার, ফুটে থাকো, লুকিয়ে থেকো না, যতকাল কবিতায় বাঁচি। In poetry. Stay alive. Show yourself clearly, like an unfailing passport photo. Stay awake in every line, you, like an unquenchable thirst. Yes, you. The pain that tears my heart apart. Show yourself clearly, like a flower in full bloom. Don't hide from me, as long as I live in poetry. The next one, I'm going to read another one that Chimada selected, which is the title poem is Acrobat. So again, Acrobat. She thought she knew acrobatics rather well, that she could juggle time with both hands, play with the now right next to the then. She would make both dance, she thought, fist to fist. And she would glide so smooth along the tightrope. She thought she could do absolutely anything at all. Only once in your life will the rope shiver.
I love the fist to fist there. It's such an unlikely way to describe, and yet it's exactly right.
Yeah, you know, she had lopalupi in Bangla actually,
Yeah,
which is slightly different, but I'm so glad that you like that, yeah. Because there is a sense of a confrontation in them, right? Sometimes love. It comes when called, like a pet cockatoo. It sits on my finger, fluttering. It sways its neck, fluffs its feathers, swings its crest, and recites its practiced lines, uttering every pleasing word. My lily-white bird repeats to me all that it has been taught and sings best, saying just what I want to hear. It pours honey into my ear. But behind my back, soon after, alone, perched on its base, my lily-white bird flatters its shiny shackles as it cackles with laughter, shedding feathers in empty space. In marriage, Pani Grohan, Banglaয় নাম. Stay close. I'm scared. It feels as if this moment is not true. Touch me, like the closest ones touch the body before cremation. This hand, take it, my hand. Hold this hand. As long as you're near me, don't leave it untouched. I'm scared. It feels as if this moment is not true. As untrue as our long yesterday. As untrue as our infinite tomorrow. Catch of the day. This is in Bangla it's called Jiol, and really captures the spirit of Ma. I want to chop it up, slice it into pieces, grind it into a paste, season it, then shut it in the oven. They didn't win. The sun, rain, the earth. It's still all raw inside, floundering like a catfish, still alive, freshly caught, my youth. And finally, for this section, that we may come back to poetry later, I want to read a poem that my mother wrote for my grandmother, for my Dimma, a few years after Dimma died. It's called Batita, the lamp. And I love this poem. So does my sister Antara. I think it really resonates with us in so many different ways. So, the lamp. Go to sleep now, Ma. It's way past 11. 11? It's still early then. But you must go to bed. You're teaching tomorrow. Ma sits in her easy chair, thick glasses perched on her thin nose, pale fingers clutching her magnifying glass. The statesman spread out across her lap. Next to her, on the table, her flask of tea, her medicines, her fragrant betel leaf in its silver case, her brass spittoon, her cash box, Behind her, on the teapoy, an earthen vase filled with her favorite white tuberoses, and a wicker table lamp weaved from Agartala. Before her, the alarm clock ticking away, her traveling timepiece. As Ma turns the pages of the newspaper, its noisy crackle splinters the quiet night. Closing my book, I come to her. As soon as I step inside, I drown in the deep perfume of those tuberoses. The nurse is dozing in her chair. Ma, please go to sleep now. It's 1:30. 1:30? She scolds. And you're still awake? Don't you have college tomorrow? Following the rebuke, I keep on wheedling. You'll get sick, Ma, if you stay up like this. You must take care of your body. My body? Ma breaks into laughter that sparkles, like jewelry shimmering from head to toe. How much more sick can it get? And what use is my body anyway? I go to her one more time before I sleep. It's 2:30, Ma. Do call it tonight. Come, let me take you to your bed. Yes, I'm coming, just coming. There's only this one tiny bit left. Reading isn't so easy now, you see. It's the gift of these cataracts. With a slight smile, embarrassed, apologetic, she buries herself again in printed words. Under the glowing light of the table lamp, with her focus on the magnifying glass, the ticking of the alarm clock fades away. As I walk back to my room, I hear her speaking softly to the nurse. No, my dear. No, don't turn off the light. Keep that lamp switched on, please. I have just one more page left. Just one more page left. One more paragraph. One more sentence. Give me one more word, dear nurse. Just one more day. Chimada, I think you should read a poem now. If you would.
After you read so well that I am abashed, but I will since I agreed to. So it's a poem called Face to Face. There are one or two faces whose eyes I can't bear to meet. When I stand before them, I feel I forgot to brush my teeth or wipe away the traces of dirt from my cheek. Because some loving faces shine just like a mirror, I can see me in them vividly, closer than even myself, and clearer.
Beautiful.
It's beautiful. I'm glad I read this poem because this poem reminds me of your mother very much.
Yeah.
Of Nabaneeta Masi, and it reminds me because, in a sense, it has the cadences of the way she spoke, and in fact. The poem you read before, the one about your Dimma, that has very much also her voice. And what I think is distinctive about her poetry in Bangla. Bangla is, to me, is uniquely gifted as a language of circumlocution. You go from one side and the approach is never direct. You always circle and there's, unless it's political poetry or something very, Shukanto or Premendra Mitra, it's never quite there. And then there's your mother who speaks, she writes poetry like she speaks, or she spoke like she writes poetry. And that's in a sense, it's very distinctive within the Bangla corpus. I think what's to me is special about reading her is just you feel like, you almost can hear her speak in those and that directness that's also her persona, I feel like there must have been those faces whose eyes she can't bear to meet. I'm sure they couldn't meet her either. I think there is a sense in which she was she was an amazing presence in a room, sort of mesmerizing. I remember, I think your birthdays, the time before she got sick, the last time I was there I think it was your birthday, and I happened to be in Kolkata.
Yes.
In August, is that?
It was exactly in August.
Yeah. So I was there, and it was, the whole room was full of people, but of course there was no one half as magnetic as her.
Exactly.
And so it was full of people. They had all come to see you. They were sitting in different groups, but then there was a sort of an ambient magnetism that filled the room, and that was emanating from her. And I feel that so I'm sure that whole, in a sense, maybe in translating her, how much of it this is both also revisiting your relationship with her, because it's not another thing that she did. This is almost her. I mean, she wrote many wonderful books, travel books in particular, which I love. But I think this voice is so essentially Nabaneeta Mashi that I mean, despite travel books are funny, but they are much more controlled. There's a distance she maintains with this traveling Nabaneeta persona, which is not here anymore. Here it's like, I'm going to let my hair down and speak exactly like I am and I feel, with all the anger and the anguish and the love and the warmth and everything else. And that to me is also means that you're, in a sense, where do you see the poetry relative to her life? Maybe that's a good way to frame that question.
Your poetry to her was, and she felt this from a very young age, that it was really a tool for survival. And it sounds dramatic, but she felt, and she gave many examples throughout her life where she felt that if she hadn't had poetry in her life, she would have disintegrated. And because of this extremely intense relationship she felt with poetry, and actually, incidentally, she felt that poetry was a vital necessity for women, not just for her, but for women. She connected poetry very strongly to the ability of women to be free, for women to have an instrument of empowerment, not only in terms of establishing an identity, but also in terms of defending violence. She saw poetry as a language of uniting with other women. So in her mind, her identity as a woman was actually very strongly connected to her identity as a poet. And as you said, she, because poetry was so important to her, she sort of saw it as an almost sacred responsibility, and one in which nothing but the starkest truth would be allowed. There was she's honest in her humor as well. She's honest in her journalism and her travel writers. And one of the reasons why they are loved so much is because she is so naked about the experiences that she has, but in a very different way. She does it with cleverness. She does it with a kind of self-conscious self-deprecation. But in her poetry, she refused to allow any artifice into it in any form. That was just not the way. She would not have it in her poetry. It was it was a sacred place for her, of a sacred way to express herself and to be. So she was not afraid to be. I mean, the poem that you read, another reason why I really love it, which I only started thinking about it after we were talking about that poem, is that you can see how exposed she felt in poetry. That poem is all about how naked she felt. But also, I wonder if that is, in a way, I thought it was about her relationship with her closest loved ones, but in a way it's about her relationship with poetry too, because she wanted to put her truest, cleanest self forward to be represented in poetry. Poetry was like a mirror to her, which she has said many times. And in that mirror, she wanted to see herself without a blemish of untruth, without, so that, to me, kind of, now I'm reading it because of the conversation we've had and because of the way you read it. I see it slightly differently as a poem that's also about her relationship with poetry. So yeah, I think it was a very visceral need that my mother had for poetry. She had a need for it that was poetry, her expression of it, and a need for it, for poetry that was visceral, and her expression of it was also visceral. When you read it, it's very instinctive, raw, uninhibited, often disturbing, but brutally honest about every expression of feeling.
I mean, in that context, maybe this is a good time for you to that poem, "The Night of the Rape."
Oh yes,
I think that's very much it's both visceral and all about, being honest.
Yes.
So maybe it's a good one. I know you have a recording of her reading it.
Yeah, that's great. I think we have a recording at the Poets House, actually, in New York, that she did on her last trip a couple of years ago, and it's a short poetry, and she reads it in I think she reads it in Bangla and I read it in English. I think we do have the video of it.
বড় হওয়ার পাঁচ রক্তপাতে ভয় পাস ছেলে কৌমার জরুরি ভয় পাস একবার রক্তের শ্বাস পেলে বুঝি সর্বনাশ শ্বাস বা না চাস তোকে রক্ত নিত্য ইশিরাকে ডাকে ছেলে তুমি বড় হয়ে ওঠো জানো না তো অক্ষরও কত হিংস্র হতে পারে জিহ্বা কত চতুরালি জানে স্বপ্ন পারা পারে কি রক্ত ঝরাতে পারে ঠোঁট
Growing up lesson. Boy, are you scared of bloodshed? Are you terrified of plucking virginity? If the taste of blood goes to your head, you fear it'll be a total calamity? The truth is, whether wrong or right, your blood calls out to you each night. Listen, boy, it's time for you to grow. Words can be as fierce, don't you know? The treachery that lingers on tongue tips, beyond the world that all your dreams show. Know that blood can be easily shed by lips.
It's an extraordinary poem.
Yeah.
I mean, just maybe I think this is something we should come back to again, but maybe before that, I mean, just in thinking about translating, I feel that, before we leave these poems, I feel like there's the choices you've made. So maybe I ask you about some of those choices, and also generally what I mean, Bangla and English, the rhythms are so different. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to hear this particular poem, "The Night of the Rape," is your translation is very true to the rhythm of the poem, and that's and I think that's but it must be challenging often, because the rhythms of the language are very different, extremely different, and I think many translations in Bangla, from Bangla to English, fail because they never quite get that. So what are the trade-offs you face? And maybe why don't you tell, and then I also ask you something in a bit about the choice of words, which is also another difficult question.
Right. I'm so glad you're asking me all of that, actually, because that's... So first of all, I chose the poems. I decided that I would not choose poems thinking about what would be hard to translate and what would not be hard to translate. I would choose poems that I loved the most. There were several poems that she had actually already said she wanted to be translated. So we had a short list, which was not very long. But beyond that, I basically chose poems that I felt were most representative of her 60 years of work, and also that were different, that had variations within them. Because at different points in her life, she wrote a certain way. You could see her priorities were, or her the way she chose to express herself was changing. So I didn't think about the difficulty or hardness of translating when I selected them. Once I had them, then if it was a poem, then my mission was to keep, to be true to the original in as many ways as I could, which included rhyming. It included the metrical structure. She was extremely well-versed, well-schooled in the formal structures of poetry, from her classical training. So she would not miss a single syllable. She was perfectionist when it came to poetic structure. So I wanted to keep that as much as I could. And I can show you that in a moment, that I also wanted the poems to look the way they did in Bengali, in English, as much as possible. That in some ways is the hardest, because what takes a few words in Bangla, as you know, can easily take multiple sentences in English, right? So that was a challenge, and I managed to do it in some. In some, I didn't manage to keep the look of it as an object on the page exactly the same. But those were some of the challenges, and along with that, there were other challenges, but we'll talk about that later, but that had to do with words, because she had this wonderful ability to make up new words. She had brilliant neologisms. So how do you translate that? She also often used words that had multiple meanings. So you needed to make a choice about that, especially in her absence. But I think the rhyming was something that she felt extremely strongly about. She had written poetry in rhyme all her life. Not all her poetry was in rhyme. A lot of it was not. But then again, much of it was. And to her, that was critical to the identity of the poem. She created meaning. She, through the rhyme, she drew emphasis through the rhyme. She created surprises, revelations through the rhyme. She expressed dissent through her rhyme. So the rhyming was quite critical to the overall meaning that emerged from the poem. It wasn't sort of decorative, or it wasn't just adding a sort of sweet tune to it. It was contributing to the inherent meaning of it. So that is something that I decided to do very, very carefully this time around. In fact, the poem that you read out, Face to Face, has a beautiful rhyming element in it. When I first translated it, I didn't actually translate it in rhyme. When it was first published in Make Up Your Mind, that's also a version that my mother really loved, that translation, but it wasn't in rhyme. When I did Acrobat, I wanted every poem that was in rhyme to be translated in rhyme. So I went back to it and revised it so that the rhyming structure could be, reproduced in the English as well. So you think about the rhyming that she used, the more and more you got into it, you saw not only her sense of irony, it wasn't, they were not ever frivolous rhymes. Sometimes the rhymes were very dark. They were surprising because they were not rhymes you would have expected. And when you have a disturbing thought, like in the poem that we read, that you just heard about the growing up lesson, but it is when the rhyme is used ostensibly to soften the bloodiness of it, it actually ends up underscoring it more. So there's a lot of that in her poetry, which is a challenge in translation, but a beautiful one.
That's super helpful. Do you want to give us an example?
I wanted to read this one poem, which is actually one of her iconic poems. It's called Ekal Chirokal. In it that didn't exist. So there's a word that she uses often called Khondokal. Now, I haven't found Khondokal in a Choluntika, but correct me if I'm wrong, Jimada, but it can be interpreted as a part of time. It can be interpreted as divided time. It can be interpreted as part of the time, which is different from a part of time or a fragment of time. Or I chose to interpret it as a divisive time. That to me worked with everything else in the poem and also resonated with what we're going through right now. And I do feel that the translation needs to be true to when the poem was written, but it also needs to be true to the context in which it is being translated. So that's the choice that I made. Okay, now I'm going to read this. Ekal Chirokal. So this is, in case you need to bring it up, this is the one that's called Right Now Forever. And you'll see it looks the same again. I kept the structure of it and the rhyming and the metrical patterns the same. আমাকে নেবাতে পারে এত শক্তি রাখে না সময়, কখনো ভেবো না আমি সময়ের মুখ চেয়ে থাকি, সময় আমার সঙ্গে খেলে যাক যুদ্ধ খেলা, যতই কারুক শাড়ি লজ্জা বস্ত্র ঠিক থাকে বাকি, মন্ত্র বলে বেলা হয়ে যাবে সব যা ছিল অবেলা, ধর্মযুদ্ধে প্রতিবাদী চিরকাল দাঁড়ায় নির্ভয়, যেহেতু সপক্ষে তার ঈশ্বর সাধিত মহাকাল, স্বয়ং সারথি হয়ে সব বুহ ভাঙেন উত্তাল, যতই দিক না যুদ্ধ খণ্ডকাল হবে পরাজিত, এই তো জেনেছি শাস্ত্রে যতটুকু হয়েছে অধীত, অখণ্ড কালের পক্ষপাত ধন্য আমি মহাশয়, আমাকে রাঙাবে চোখ এত শক্তি রাখে না সময়. Right now, forever. Time has not the power to extinguish me. Don't think for a moment that I wait upon time. Let time keep on playing his absurd battle game. Every time he strips me, I rise clothed without shame. With the force of prayer of spells magic and divine, all that was untimely will turn auspicious, sublime. In a just war, the rebel stands forever unafraid. For her ally is eternity, who, divinely arrayed, guides her chariot, destroying the enemy line. Thus, a divisive age will be defeated and spurned. Though it brings on great wars, it will lose every time. From all our scriptures, this is the truth I have learned. Please know that I am cherished by an undivided, infinite age. Time will never have the power to scorch me with its rage.
I hope you and she are right. This is the hope, after all. That there is the infinite time that's with us and will keep us. I think we are running out of time, so I wanted to end by asking one last question, which is, reading these poems, you feel very much, you feel her warmth, her vivaciousness, but also just the emotionality of it all. And it must, you must have been growing up, you must have had your own ups and downs and challenges. How was it to have her as your mother? Since I think this is for Mother's Day, I wanted to end on this question because it's really, she's a very special person, a very but a very vivid one. But also a person who writes in this poem called Night. She's writing about suicide, and and if you don't, unless it would be a stretch to say it's not someone else's suicide. It sounds like hers.
You're right.
And there's this poem where she says the ocean will carry me away, not in a boat, but a wave will carry me away, something like that. So it's just that there is a sense in which there is that particular as you said, honest and very direct admission of her pain, and how is it to be a daughter to someone like that? So let's I mean, whatever you want to say, it's an awkward question, but
it's not at all an awkward question. Actually, it's a brilliant question, because we often don't think about how the writing of a parent, how the work that they do, the art that they create, the relationship that they create with their art, how that affects the relationship that they have with their children.
Yeah,
I think it's a very brilliant question to ask. And with her, part of it was that there was the poetry which was left for her most kind of deepest, truest expressions of her soul. She really bared her soul and her fears in her poetry. In her prose, she laughed at herself, and she wasn't afraid to make fun of herself, just in the same way as she was not afraid at all to cry her heart out in her poetry. So we kind of grew up with both, and sometimes they neutralized each other, and sometimes it was actually it was dizzying, because they were both true to her. They were both as real in her life. The optimism and the great joy for life and the huge ability to love, that was completely true to her as a person. And yet this understanding of the of the pain that women especially go through. She also had a very fraught. She loved language. She saw it as a way to freedom, but she also saw it as language as potentially destructive. So she felt both attracted to and repulsed by language, and you could see that in some of her poetry as well. So I think, as a child, what all of that meant. I mean, and then when you, just to say one thing about that last poem, as you said, you hope that she is right, that time will not have the power to scorch us. She used all of these. Another thing that made it difficult to translate is because there were, of course, which you would recognize, there are all these allusions to and metaphors from our epics, from our epic battles, from the ordeals that our epic women, from Radha and Draupadi, went through. And somehow she uses all of those to make it a story about every woman, and also a story about her. And I think that is sort of how we grew up thinking of her and thinking about ourselves. We never ever thought that as a girl there was anything that we were not able to do. And I don't mean that in the kind of, simplistic way, is that, well, there's nothing you cannot do if you set your mind to it. What I mean is that there was nothing that was excluded for us. None of the joys, none of the powers, none of the pains, none of the complications, none of the accusations. They were all ours. And so you had a feeling that as a girl, there was we would not be limited by our girl's identity to do anything that we wanted. At the same time, it was clear to us that being a girl was a very beautiful but a very complicated thing, and it brought with it a lot of responsibility. I think one of the, and we also grew up in an all-female family, right? So there was my grandmother, who was also a feminist poet, and a path-breaking, trailblazing one in her own way, and Ma and my Didi, Ankara, and me. So there were no boys, there were no men in this family, and something about growing up in an all-female family really makes you intrepid and irreverent, both of which I think has helped, both of which have helped us in the way we've turned out to be. But there were practical things about having her as a mother, which were amazing, because I kept getting into trouble at school. I was a very good student, so they didn't want to throw me out, but I was not popular with the students because I was seen as a troublemaker. I was seen as somebody who was always doing things her own way and breaking rules. And Mark kept being called in to be complained to, and she always stood up for me every single time. And it may sound like a small thing, but you will understand it, because in Bengali middle class, and our school was a very middle class school, even though it was a English medium school. It's very different from here, where you have tiger moms going and taking on the school board. That's not the way it works in India. I didn't see any other friends who got into trouble where the parents went to school and told them off, and supported their kids. But it really made me feel that, I could, no matter what, that I would grow up and there would be conflict and there will be accusations hurled at me, but I should not let that affect my trust in myself. This is something that I got absolutely from her. And even though, Kolkata was a fairly progressive city, and, I had so many friends going to school with me, being in the neighborhood with me, and not to say that they had, really restricted lives, but I didn't see that kind of freedom of thinking in their families that I saw in ours. And the other thing I want to say, which is, she was formidable in her sort of search for social justice through her work, through her poetry, through her journalism, through her prose. She could be very, very tough, and as you said, she could be quite raw, quite bloody, quite violent in her poetry as well, in her quest for truth. But there was a side of her that was incredibly tender, and she had the kind of ability to love. I don't think I've seen anyone else who quite had that capacity to love. And she was also a very huggy, kissy person. She loved cuddling, she loved hugging, she loved kissing, all of which I inherited. I've inherited a lot of things from my father, but these are things that I have certainly inherited from my mother. And the tenderness of it, the kind of fearlessness, we were talking about her honesty and her fearlessness. So the honesty and fearlessness that we saw in her work, in terms of her emotions, she also brought that honesty and fearlessness in showing her emotions in life. So she was not afraid to show her love. She was in a family with a friend. She was not afraid to show her disappointment or her heartbreak. There was a very clear kind of merging between the way she was in her work, certainly in her poetry, and the way she was in her personal life as a mother. And I think that helped me a lot, because it taught me to really be able to embrace my emotions, and even if they were uncomfortable, not to be embarrassed by them. I'm sort of famously argumentative, so I often get into arguments with people, but I have never lost a friend in my whole life. And I think that is something that I've learned. I am that way because of my mother, because I understood that you can be full of love and yet disagree, and yet continue to be full of love and not have to bend. So I think the person I am in my family, with my friends, as a social creature, apart from the person as I am as a creative person, a writer, a translator, I think has been so deeply influenced by who she was.
It seems like a wonderful place to end, I would say. And maybe to end this conversation, I think it's been wonderful, and in a sense, takes me back over all these 50-something years I've known her. Maybe that letter that you wrote, I think that's maybe a good way to end.
Wonderful. I'd love to. Jimada, I started writing this letter many years ago. In fact, I started writing it, I think, on her 70th birthday. And I kept adding to it. And I completed it only after she died. But she had read most of it when she had read most of it. And she had asked me, she was extremely excited about Acrobat being published. And she said to me, if the book is published and I am not able to introduce it, then I want you to use that letter as a way of introducing me in the book. So we did. That's why it's in the book. So, let me put it right here. A letter to Ma. It is true I was created in you. It is also true that you were created for me. Maya Angelou. My first semester in college. You arrived in between your conferences, suitcases and admirers in tow. Refusing abundant offers of hospitality in Cambridge, you shared and immediately redecorated the 1.5 rooms assigned to my 2 roommates and me. Every morning, you stood in line in our noisy dormitory to claim your 3 minutes in the shower. You preferred the modern steel and glass shower stalls opposite our room to the quieter, more old-fashioned bathroom down the hall. You left after a week, just as I was getting used to finding your hip-length hair in my comb and turning every head in the 1,000-strong Harvard Union, where you swept into dinner with me, gliding in like a queen, like you always did. A few weeks later, we hit midterm exams. I overslept the first day, found the showers occupied and sprinted to the other bathroom in panic. As I stumbled onto freezing tiles and fiddled with the cranky knob that spurted cold water for red and boiling for blue, something miraculously familiar caught my eye. A crimson dot of velvet on the narrow grey wall. Your well-traveled bindi, carefully transported from your forehead and placed beyond reach of the spray. In a flash, I could hear your laugh and smell your scent. I could feel the tension in my neck melt into the mist surrounding me. That perfect circle of red gave evidence on that mildewed wall that you would always be there, far away, so close. Eternity, poem, j'adore, treasure, happy, forever and ever. Why did your favorite poems always seem to talk about you? The text ran away from me. Yes, why did your favorite perfumes always seem to talk about you? And yet, no matter which one you wore, you always smelled wondrously the same. It's that essence of Ma, that adjective-defying, all too familiar fragrance that lingered in your sari before it was washed, that seeped out of your suitcase as soon as you opened it. The same essence greeted us every evening years ago, along with your whistled code, as Didi and I raced each other down the stairs to let you in after work. You would be awake for hours each night after we went to sleep, correcting tutorials, completing conference papers, finishing a painting, writing a poem. I never knew when you came to bed, but even in my dreams, I'd get a whiff of that Ma smell when you vigorously rubbed Nivea on our sleep-heavy faces. I could feel its embrace so strongly the night you slipped away. As I held you close, while Didi and I sang your favorite Tagore songs, your fragrance wrapped us up in all its tenderness. You're the one who taught us to love songs and to love books. Our growing up years were filled with poetry festivals and book fairs, rather than animation films and amusement parks. And while I complained about that as a child, because of you, poetry became a lifelong ally. Watching you write and rewrite every line of your work, I was captivated by the process of editing books, which turned into my first career. You and I loved every one of our literary projects together. When we were translating your poems in my college dormitory, you relished my stash of instant hot chocolate almost as much as our heated arguments over each word late into the night. Years later, on your 75th birthday, I was thrilled to see your face light up when you unwrapped your surprise gift, a published copy of my translation of your latest book of poetry, Make Up Your Mind. Just 10 days before you died, we received the cover design of our dream project, Acrobat. You had chosen the image, a Tagore painting, with meticulous care, though the manuscript was yet to be written. With your famously dazzling smile, undiminished by illness, you exclaimed, "This is my first book to be published by a truly international press. I'm definitely going to stick around for this one." Although there were unending demands on your time, a few years ago, you had somehow managed to find several days for us to translate together my bedtime book for children, Not Yet. The book is a playful dialogue and rhyme between a mother and a child. A naughty little girl finds countless excuses not to go to bed, while her ever-patient mother is determined to put her to sleep. The literal Bengali translation of Not Yet is Akonina. But you had laughed your own little girl laugh and declared, no, the girl must be much more emphatic. She will say, Ekunina, Ekunina. Well, this obstinate daughter of yours kept saying to her mother in the last few weeks, Ekunina, Ekunina. Could you hear me, Ma? Not too long ago, I pulled a big blue book from our Kolkata shelf, 365 bedtime stories. When I opened it, out fell a red gold rush of leaves, oaks, maples, and ferns collected in London when I was a toddler. We had gathered them together in the woods at the bottom of the hill where we lived. One night, as you were reading to me about Tinker Bell, I interrupted you with a technical question. What are fairy wings made of, Ma? Butterfly wings? Bird feathers? Or huge petals? Well, there are all kinds of fairies, you see, you replied. Just like there are all kinds of people. Do all fairies look like you then? I persisted. I don't think so, you smiled. Fairies are very, very beautiful. But Ma, I protested, you are the most beautiful person in the world. You laughed, much more raucously than Tinker Bell would, as you drew heavy curtains over tall windows. Every little girl believes that about their mother, Tunkush. Well, Ma, I've grown up a bit. My world has grown up a lot. I left home as a child and made beautiful friends who became my family. In my work, I've met many beautiful faces, walked with beautiful figures. I've fallen in love with beautiful minds. You grew up too. More books published, many awards won. A few more clashes with your stubbornly loving daughters. Around your eyes, a few more lines celebrating years of full-throated life. A few more world tours, many with me when you swept me away with your limitless appetite for discovery, your infectious sense of wonder. Remember that list we made some years ago of unvisited countries that you absolutely had to explore? Wheelchair in tow, we made it to most entries on that list. China, Egypt, South Africa. But not Myanmar. Each time we traveled, you transformed our adventures into provocative essays or best-selling books. And on every trip, we shared even more pleasures together than our plentiful arguments. Yes, we did have fights. I cried when you didn't understand. I begged you not to nag. I yelled at you when I was upset with someone else. I watched in panic as tears welled up in your ever-adolescent eyes. But I am as sure today as I was that night in London that even if you had not been my mother, even if that most precious accident of birth had by rights been the beginning of someone else's story, even if I'd met you in any of your other roles, as a poet, a professor, painter, friend, or a stranger on a plane, you would still be the most beautiful person I could ever have met. At the end of Not Yet, the daughter asks, Ma, did you turn out the light? And the mother replies, Yes, my dear. Now, good night.
Wow. That was so deeply touching. That's such an emotional moment for all of us. And I think I'm really overwhelmed with the emotions. And what a life, what a celebration this has been of her life, Nandana. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this book with us and having this conversation that our followers can watch and join in and participate. It was lovely, so lovely to hear you read out your mother's poems and talk about her on this extremely special day that honors mothers. So such a fitting, celebration. As Abhijit rightly said, we hear her voice in these poems exactly as she was. I think the poetry brings such bold imagery, and it's expressed in such an exquisite language, and nothing is lost in translation. So kudos for your work, and kudos that she was able to see the cover and she was able to participate in this. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And Acrobat certainly is going to be a book that will be widely loved and celebrated and treasured. So congratulations again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing
Thank
it.
you.
Himada, thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you,
including
Abhijit.
me,
Thank you,
in
Abhijit.
this.
Well,
Thank you so
Welcome.
much,
Thank
Abhijit.
you.
I could not have done it with anyone else. Thank you for agreeing to do it. No, I couldn't have.
And I really thank you, Abhijit, for taking the time, for agreeing to be part of this conversation, actually sharing so many private moments and memories with us. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Sorry, that was my mute. So that was thank you, everyone, for joining in. We are now on our live Q&A with actress, writer, activist Nandana Sen. I would like to first start off by, thanking you again, because this is such a difficult time in our society, and I'm thankful that you're able to spend this, time of yours and join us today. We had taped this conversation a couple of weeks ago, to accommodate the time zone differences and availability. Abhijit is based in Paris and has a tight schedule. At that time, the pandemic situation in India was very different. We would like to take a moment here to think about all the people we have lost through the pandemic. The entire IAAC team is heartbroken with the amount of devastation that this has caused. We have all individually tried to provide relief through donations and other resources to people in distress. But as an organization, we've also started a fundraiser for COVID relief for artists, and I'll soon post more about it on the IAAC platform. So please stay tuned and please support our fundraiser. Poetry forces us to confront our innermost thoughts and feelings and provides a comfortable format to be able to share them with others. I hope our session today brings some sense of optimism in times such as this. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. Nandana is here to answer any questions you might have about the book, about her work, and about her mother. Please feel free to ask your questions in the comment section, and we will try our best to answer them as much as time permits. Nandana, thank you so much. I just want to also mention that for those of you who are watching on YouTube, we really urge you to join our live stream on Facebook. Our Facebook handle is iaac.us. Please come over to the live stream on Facebook and please post your comments there so we see them and we get Nandana to answer them. Nandana, thank you. I'd like to first start off with some questions I have collated from audience members during the live stream. But first, here's my first question, and that's about how did you arrive at the title of the book? Was your mother involved in the process?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So the title of the book is derived from a poem of hers called, actually, Madari. It's the Bengali poem is called Acrobatics rather than the Acrobat, and in the translation we changed the title slightly. And to me, the poem clearly seemed to be about the multitasking that every woman has to go through. And so I asked Ma when we were looking for a title for the book if Acrobat would be a good name, and she loved it because it allowed us to draw attention to the multiple identities that women need to inhabit, and also how the ways of achieving what they need to achieve lie in the skill of a balancing act. So that's how the title happened. And also Jill Schoolman, who's my wonderful publisher at Archipelago Books, loved the title as well, and that's quickly got finalized. And then Jill actually put the cover together with the title, so my mother saw the book as, as it looks now. She sort of seen it in this version. Nice. But one thing I want to say, since you asked that question, I asked her, in Bangla, as I said, I changed Madari acrobatics into Acrobat, but also in Bangla, we do not have gender-specific pronouns. So in Bengali, it was she, which I chose to translate into a she. And okay. Asked her about it. I said to her, and also this poem that I translated in secret because it was part of I was putting it in a book that was a birthday surprise for her, so I couldn't quite ask her about these questions when I was translating. But afterwards, when the surprise was over, I asked her, do you think that was the right choice for me to have made, that I made it a she? And she said, yes, it was, because it transformed the poem and it made it into a feminist poem, which actually is not how I had written it. I had written it about the balancing act that every artist has to go through, and the fact that one word that is too heavy or one stroke of the brush that is too thick could actually throw you from the tightrope. And it was just fascinating for me that her own interpretation of the poem and what had inspired her to write the poem was quite different from mine. Right. And yet she loved the way I had read the poem and I had translated it.
Wow. Okay. I have audience questions for you. I have them here. If you can give me a minute. I have some comments, not just questions. Debjyoti Chatterjee says she likes your translations very much.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Subbalakshmi Mukherjee, when Kuku Dee wrote these poems, did she read them to you? Tell us about your conversations and how you shared the honesty and nakedness in your poetry.
Yes, no, she didn't write the poem. She didn't read out the poems. I mean, she wrote poetry all her life, right? She started writing poetry long before my sister and I were born. She started writing poetry when she published her first book of poems when she was 21 years old. But yes, sometimes she would read out the poems that she had read, she had just written. When I was in college, I actually would get, blue aerograms and those yellow envelopes, Indian Postal Service envelopes. And she would sometimes send lines of poetry in it. She would sometimes send Xeroxes or kind of clippings of, Deshpotrikate, a poem had come out and she would cut it out and send it. So she was very generous about sharing her poetry with both of us, and also with our grandmother, who was her strongest critic and her biggest, most kind of scrupulous editor. So she was very open that way, but I think we also, what we took away from that was just which I talked about a little bit earlier, just the ability to be uninhibited in expressing your emotions. And I think both my Didi and I really inherited that from her, and through her poetry, from the way she was and from the way she wrote.
I have some more comments that came in. Srilata Ganguly says, brilliant translation. Congratulations, Nandana.
Thank you so much.
Paul says, blood can be shed by lips. Wow, such a profound truth, so elegantly expressed. I'm very moved by the sense of sacred truth that you speak of, Nandana, that is so viscerally present in your mother's poems. All these poems seem to come from the perspective of a life fully lived and wisdom hard-earned. I'm wondering when the poems in this collection were written, and if the entire body of a poetry can be looked as expressions of different periods of a life. And this is coming to something that we also discussed, Nandana.
Yes, yeah. I think it absolutely, that's completely right, Srilata Mashi. Thank you for making that astute observation. So, as I mentioned, she started writing poetry. She started publishing poetry at 21, but she started writing poetry at 6. And she scribbled poems in her Kobitar Khata until a few weeks before she died. So her life was wrapped up in poetry in a way. So choosing poems that would represent all of a lifetime of luminous poetry is not an easy task. Yeah. But I think she definitely wrote in different ways. I guess that makes sense. I'm sure many writers make different choices depending on what is the emotional truth at the time of writing. So the poems in Prothom Protoy, her first book, are very different from her second book of poetry, Shagboto Devdut, which actually came out after a gap of 13 years. 13 years in which she was very, very happily married and raising us and working as an academic, but wasn't focusing on her career as a poet. And she kept writing poetry throughout that time too, but not for public consumption. She wasn't publishing them. Mm-hmm. So those were very different. She wrote a lot of poetry in English, actually, when she was in England, and my parents were separating, and they were quite, some of them were quite dark, and some of them were actually also very bold and playful in a way that she later said she couldn't quite capture that naughtiness in Bengali, because she felt a certain kind of moral responsibility to be good in Bengali, whereas she felt she could be more transgressive in English. So, and she embraced that that power that writing in the tongue gave her. So, but the short answer to that is that I think when I had grown up, my sister and I grew up with this poetry, so we knew the poetry all our lives, and this speaks a little bit to Mamoni Shubhalakshmi's question as well. We loved it, but we also kind of took them for granted, not because we didn't love them, but they were just, we were surrounded by them in a way. We knew the words by heart. And when I was doing this project, it just became, it seemed to me, and also because I was trying to choose poems from a kind of, I was trying to set it in some kind of a chronological framework, I realized that a lot of, there were many aspects of her life that I could understand much better through her poetry. So yes, Mamoni, I think the nakedness in her poetry made me understand a great deal of the mysterious parts of her life. For instance, my grandmother and my mother were always extremely close. And and yet their relationship was quite complicated. It was both intimate and also intricate, and it was ruled by love, but there was also there were very, there was ambition, there were creative expectations, it was a combination of emotions that are not unique in a family between mothers and daughters. But I only managed to understand that much better through her poetry, even though I lived with them all my life. I understood the separation between my parents much better through her poetry. I understood the need that my mother had to use poetry in her life as a coping mechanism, that poetry was sort of like therapy for her. There were lots of things that became clearer to me because she wrote differently at different parts of her life, and because she revealed so much of herself through her poetry.
Sure. Yeah, very well said. I have some more comments which came in. Marine says, beautiful. Meeta Sinha says, lovely poems, beautifully presented. I have one more question coming up, which is, one second. So, we heard you talk about the difficulties of translating from a native language, especially poetry, as you not only do you need to take care of the meaning and verse, but also rhyme and tone. I was intrigued when you told that you decided that every poem originally written in rhyme would also translate in rhyme.
Yes.
So could you for us read a poem in Bengali and English so we hear the resonances in rhyme?
Oh, yeah. What a lovely assignment. There are a lot of those poems, so I'm going to choose a shorter one, and I'm going to let me read it to you in Bangla first, and then I'll read it to you in English. This in Bangla, it's called Bhalobasha Baro.
Okay.
তুমি চেয়েছিলে নিরুপাধি প্রেম অনধিগম্য, আমি গেথে আনি লবঙ্গ লতা তোমারই জন্য। তুমি বুঝি চাও প্রেমের বাতাস নাতিশীতোষ্ণ, আমি বইয়ে দিই কাল বৈশাখী ভয়াল কৃষ্ণ। তোমার প্রণয় প্রযুক্ত নয় দূর বিশুদ্ধ, আমার প্রণয় কিছুটা প্রণয় কিছুটা যুদ্ধ। And in English, out of reach. This way. You asked for a nameless love out of reach. I weaved you a wreath of blooms, each to each. You want love's temperate zone, softly sighing. I blow you a dark thunderstorm, terrifying. Your love is detached, afar, chaste to its core. My love is in part love and in part war. This one has a very, specific rhyming structure, an AABB-CC structure, and also a very particular metrical pattern rhythm, the way the poem scans a particular way. And it also looks a certain way on the poem, on the page, and I wanted to be true to all of those aspects, to the form and the content in the translation. And yeah, so this is an example of, I hope you could hear the similarities in the rhymes and the rhythm of it. I have to say that this poem is, again, connected to what we were talking about earlier. I think this is one of those poems that taught us that much of love, or a part of love at least, is war. And I think the love that we felt with the love that we have for our mother, and the love that our mother had for our grandmother, and the other way around, the love that they had for us, it all involved a lot of love and a bit of war.
That's right. That's right. And actually, that brings me to the next question. And unfortunately, I'm afraid this will be the last question. Although, if you have any other questions, viewers, please reach out to Nandana Dev Se. She's on all social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn at the same handle, Nandana Dev Se. And she'll be glad to answer any questions about the book or about the work on poetry. But coming to this. The last question, Anandra, and very apt that you mentioned the relation between the mother and the child, because we're celebrating Mother's Day too this weekend, and so I want to ask, how much of the work done by your mother has influenced your work and activism, and also how with your own daughter, how much of poetry are you doing, and what's the relation like that over there?
Wow, those are both very lovely questions. Very distinct questions. I think we were hugely influenced by her work, and I mean, I spoke about it a bit with Abhijita earlier, with Jimada earlier, and I think, but let me focus on the second part of that question. How did her activism affect mine? I think that's a very interesting question to ask, because she was an activist writer. She had a very strong political sensibility and very strong sense of social justice, which she brought into her writing, whether it was her prose, her poetry, her journalism. It was all not only very feminist, but it also spoke out very strongly against the politics of hate and divisive forces. So I think I took away from that the importance of kind of walking the talk through your work. So apart from the grassroots work that I do, in terms of the work that I do with children, whether it's working with kids in shelters or on the street or on hospitals or in schools, that in addition to that, the work I do as an artist, as a writer, and as an actor has a great deal to do with that too. For instance, it's not a coincidence that the very first mainstream Bombay film that I did, this film called Black, is about the rights of disabled children. The first play that I did, which ran at Prithvi Theatre in Bombay and was a groundbreaking play called 30 Days in September, was the first play of its kind, and it was based on the first report on child sexual abuse that had been done nationally. And there I played a survivor of child sexual abuse, and there had been nothing like that in the popular culture space at all. Right. And I played a young girl who runs away from the police in South Africa during apartheid. So they were all the work that my involvement with the rights of children have been reflected in the work that I've done both as an actor and as a writer. My first book, Mambi and the Forest Fire, came together in a workshop that I was doing with children who had been rescued from trafficking in a home called Sneha, just outside of Calcutta. So, and there's my second book, which is not my second book, the last book, In My Heart, which is about adoption, had various inspirations behind it, but certainly was deeply influenced by the fact that because of all the work that I did with children who were institutionalized or homeless, it became very important to find a way of talking about how those lives, those hundreds of thousands, millions, actually, we have 2 million children living on the streets of India, those lives could be transformed by bringing them into loving homes, right? So everything is sort of connected. My activism is very connected to my work as a writer and as an actor, and that I absolutely learned from my mother.
Okay. I said that was the last question, but I have had 2 other comments which came in. One of them, Anindita Ganguly, and feel free to say, if we want to do this later, offline.
No, I'd love to. I mean, I'm having so much fun.
what a beautiful gift for Mother's Day. A gift that as a mother, I would love to share with my daughters. May I request Nandana to please read Too Much? I have one more question.
Of course. Now, Anindita, would you like me to read it in English or Bangla?
I think you'll have to take a call then, Nandana.
Okay, I think I'll read it in English just
Okay.
because there may be more people who'll understand it. Did I ask for too much then? I wanted just 2 eyes, nothing more. No dawn, no dusk, no long night. Not food, nor clothes, nor shelter. Neither remembrance nor reflection, but just a moment's attention to be erased in the next moment. That's all. Still, did I ask for too much? I'll read it in Bangla since...
Yeah, I think so. She says both, so yeah.
It's both, okay. Let me just find it, yeah. আমার চাওয়া কি তবে খুব বেশি ছিল? চেয়েছি কেবল 2টি চোখ, আর কিছু নয়। ভোর নয়, সন্ধ্যা নয়, মধ্যরাত্রি নয়, অন্য বস্ত্র ছাদ নয়, স্মরণ মনন কিছু নয়। মুহূর্তের মনোযোগ, পরের মুহূর্তে মুছে যাওয়া, মাত্র এই আমার চাওয়া কি তবু খুব বেশি ছিল?
Very nice. And we have the other question that was there. Beautiful translations. So interesting to hear how you navigate the genderless aspect of pronouns between English and Bangla. How do you convey the status that is inherent in Bengali pronouns but absent in English pronouns? Wow.
Yeah, so
Great.
that's so interesting. I spoke about it a little bit earlier, right, when I was talking about...
Yes.
Sorry, am I talking over you? No. Were you
No.
saying something, Suman? No. So, you know, it is a choice. It is sometimes it's clear from the poem because it's called Meta, or the character is a girl, so it's not confusing. But there are a few poems where one had to make that choice, and you know, you just go like, so with Acrobat, I made the choice that seemed to be obvious to me, and that's the beauty of translation and reinterpretation in a way, because it's only much later that I found out that that's not the way my mother had seen it. And to her, the gender was not important in that poem, whereas to me, that was central to the poem. So, but she was writing about an artist, and I was writing about a woman's balancing act. So it's always a case-by-case call, just like there are so many, there are things like idioms and that you cannot really translate. So you have to come to a cultural equivalent of some kind.
Right.
So it's a judgment call, and that's what those decisions were based on as well.
All right. Thank you so much. We've had a great evening. Thank you so much. For those of you who would like to order the book Acrobat, you can pre-order the book right now, and it's available on archipelagobooks.org. For signed copies, you can reach out to Emma, E-M-M-A, Emma at archipelagobooks.org. So please go ahead, order your book, and enjoy the book at your own convenience. We wish you and all of your families to be safe and healthy during this time. And have a great evening. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, and I want to say Happy Mother's Day to everyone. I want to say that our hearts and minds are in India, and I want to thank everyone for standing in solidarity. I also want to say, since we've devoted this evening to Bengali poetry, that there is another reason why today is very special, and that is because it is the birthday weekend of Rabindranath Tagore, 25 Boishakh, and I was so delighted to hear a tune composed by him at the beginning of this event. I think the connection must have been that it's his birthday this weekend. So Shubho Pochishe Boishak to everybody, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.